The smell of scorched alloy and rebreathed air hit Mace Calloway the moment he pushed through the pressure seal into auction ring 7. And it took him exactly 4 seconds to understand he'd walked into something worse than a junk sale. He'd expected junk. Scrapyard Station Verev was the largest decommissioned hull depot in the Cathari Reach, a rusted accordion of pressurized corridors and poorly lit bays hanging off the underside of an asteroid like a barnacle on a dead whale. People came here to buy stripped-out nav cores, second-hand reactor housings, and the occasional hull panel still worth the argon it was filled with. They did not come here to buy living things. Mace stood at the back of the gallery and looked at the cage on the auction platform. She was sitting on the floor of it with her knees pulled to her chest and her back against the bars, as if she had decided the cage was hers, and the 200 bidders crowded into the gallery were the ones who needed permission to enter. Her skin was the deep blue-gray of storm-charged ocean water, her hair the color of polished carbon, and her eyes, when she finally looked up and found Mace's across the room, were the pale, incandescent silver green of a ship's running light seen through fog. She wore a collar of dull black metal at her throat. It was the ugliest thing in the room, and the room was full of stripped-out warp housings, and a man in the front row eating something that smelled like a burning tire. The collar pulsed once, a slow throb of red light. She didn't flinch. She had the expression of someone who had decided, a long time ago, to stop flinching. The auctioneer was a Cathari male named Vosk, wide as a cargo pallet, and oiled with the particular confidence of a man who had never once wondered whether what he was doing was legal. He stood at the podium with the collar's control key on a chain around his neck and described the item. Vosk-class Orion female, he said. Age approximately 23 cycles by standard reckoning. The collar is a Synapse Series 9, bonded to her brainstem, non-removable without the full key sequence. Compliant under active signal. Smart enough to be useful, not smart enough to be trouble. Mace's jaw tightened. He had come to Ring 7 to buy a navigation array. Specifically the nav array from a decommissioned Herring-class hauler that Vosk's people had stripped 6 weeks ago, which Mace needed for his own ship, the Marginal Gain, a 40-year-old cargo runner that was currently held together by patch welds and stubbornness. He had a budget of 1,200 trade credits, which was exactly what the nav array cost, and not a single unit more. The bidding started at 400. He told himself it wasn't his problem. He told himself it twice more over the next 3 minutes while the number climbed. He was a freight pilot with a ship full of debt and a route through the Reach that barely covered fuel costs. He was not a rescue operation. He had no plan, no legal standing, no spare space in the Marginal Gain's single habitable cabin, and absolutely no idea what an Orion female's dietary requirements were. The bid hit 900 and stalled. Vosk looked out at the gallery with the patient smile of a man who knew how to wait. The woman in the cage did not look at the crowd. She was looking at a point on the floor between her feet, and she was very still, and Mace had the uncomfortable sense that she was doing what he recognized as the thing you do when you are trying not to let anyone see how frightened you are. He'd done it himself in a Cathari customs base 6 years ago, when a border authority inspector had decided his cargo manifest was worth a thorough look. You fix your eyes on one spot. You breathe. You do not give them the satisfaction of watching you come apart. 950 from the front row. Mace raised his hand. 1,000, he said. Heads turned. Vosk found him and his smile widened slightly. 1,000 from the human in the back. Do I hear 1,100? The man in the front row, heavyset, Dranian by the cut of his collar, the kind of buyer who showed up to these auctions with a ledger and no conscience, turned around in his seat and looked at Mace with the measuring expression of someone calculating whether this was a real competitor or a civilian making a statement. Mace held his gaze and said nothing. The Dranian turned back and raised a finger. 1,100. 1,200, Mace said immediately. He felt his stomach drop as he said it. 1200 was the nav array. 1200 was the one thing he'd come here to buy, and without it the marginal gains jump plotting would remain what it currently was. A hand-drawn star chart, 3-year-old positional data and prayer. 13, said the Dranian. Mace was quiet for a moment. He thought about the star chart. He thought about the look on the woman's face when she'd found his eyes across the room, that particular stillness that was not peace but the armored approximation of it. 1350, he said. He did not have 1,350 trade credits. He had 1,200 and a reputation with a fuel depot on Verev Station's upper ring who might extend him 30 days of credit. Probably. The Dranian sat back in his seat. He was quiet for long enough that Mace understood the man was doing the same math he was doing, whether she was worth more than the bid, whether the bidder behind him was serious, whether cutting losses now was the smarter play. In the end, the Dranian shook his head and turned back to his ledger. Sold, said Vosk, to the human in the back, for 1,350. The collar pulsed once, red, in what Mace was starting to think was its resting heartbeat. The woman raised her eyes. She looked at him for exactly 3 seconds, her expression entirely unreadable, and then she looked away. The transfer paperwork took 40 minutes and cost him another 20 credits in processing fees, which he paid with the specific expressionless calm of a man writing checks on an account he knows is already overdrawn. Vosk handed him the collar's secondary control key, a flat black disc the size of a coin, which would let him trigger the collar's compliance signal, with the cheerful efficiency of someone completing a routine transaction. She understands standard, Vosk said. Been on the station 3 weeks, ate about what you'd expect, sleeps on the floor, doesn't complain. He paused. She did try to remove the collar herself when she first came in. We had to demonstrate the consequences of that. She hasn't tried since. Mace put the disc in his pocket without looking at it. He went to collect her from the holding pen behind the auction ring and found her standing, which surprised him. He'd expected her to still be sitting, the way she'd been in the cage. Instead, she was on her feet in the center of the pen with her arms at her sides and her chin level, and the collar a black line against the storm blue of her throat, and she was watching him the way you watch something you haven't decided about yet. He stopped in the doorway and thought about what to say and rejected several versions of it. He was not good at this. He was good at fuel ratios and manifest logistics, and the particular calculus of coaxing a 40-year-old ship through jump corridors that were slightly too narrow for her width. He said, I'm Mace, I have a ship. You can leave whenever you want. She said nothing for a moment. Then, the collar stays active within 300 meters of whoever holds the key. Her voice was lower than he'd expected, and precise, with the careful enunciation of someone who had learned standard from immersion rather than instruction. If I go past 300 meters without a signal override, it activates. I know, he said, so we'll have to figure that out. Can you remove it? I don't know yet, I'd like to try. She looked at him for another long moment with those pale silver-green eyes, and he had the distinct impression she was running some kind of internal calculation that he was not privy to, and that the outcome of it was not guaranteed in his favor. What do you want from me? She said. It wasn't quite a question. Nothing, he said. I bought you so that man in the front row couldn't. That is not a sustainable philosophy. No, he agreed, it isn't, but here we are. She was quiet again. Then she said, my name is Sieve. In the Orient tongue it means the last light before a storm. My people chose names that way for what a child was born in the middle of. He filed that away. Mace, he said again. My mother named me after a spice because she thought it sounded distinguished. It didn't. Something shifted in her face. Not quite a smile, but something adjacent to one, something that lived in the same neighborhood. You are strange, she said. I've been told, he said. Do you want to see the ship? The marginal gain was docked in Bay 14, which was the cheapest bay on the station, and accordingly the one with the atmospheric recyclers that needed the most convincing. Mace walked her through the station corridors with slightly more space between them than felt natural, because he was conscious of the key in his pocket and didn't want her to be conscious of him being conscious of it. She walked the way she'd sat in the cage, as if the space was hers and she was simply allowing others to share it. He keyed open the marginal gains, boarding ramp, and stood aside. She walked up it and stopped in the cargo bay and looked around at the organized clutter of a working freighter. Stacked storage units, a hand-welded equipment rack, 3 different kinds of patch repair compound arranged by viscosity, a half-disassembled atmospheric sensor hanging from the ceiling on a cable, because Mace had been fixing it 2 weeks ago and run out of the right fasteners. "This is very old," she said. "She prefers experienced," Mace said. Steve moved to the atmospheric sensor and looked at it for a moment, her head tilting slightly. She reached up and touched one of the exposed connection points with 2 fingers, careful, precise. "This ground is wrong," she said. "It's reading atmospheric particulate count from the cargo bay instead of from the cabin. You've been getting false alerts." Mace stared at her. He had been getting false alerts for 3 months and had assumed it was a sensor calibration problem, which he had been meaning to address whenever he had 4 spare hours and the right fasteners, neither of which had materialized. "How did you?" "My people built things," she said. It was a simple statement, flat and careful, with something underneath it that he didn't push. She lowered her hand. "Do you have a tool kit?" He showed her the tool kit. He showed her the cabin, the galley, the engine room. She walked through each space the way she'd done the cargo bay, looking at things with the particular attentiveness of someone who has spent a long time noticing what's wrong with machines and thinking about how to fix them. In the engine room, she stopped in front of the jump drive housing and put one hand on the outer casing and tilted her head at a slight angle, her eyes going distant in the way of someone listening to something below the threshold of normal hearing. "There is a resonance in the secondary coil," she said. "It is not critical yet, but under prolonged jump conditions, the oscillation will amplify. In a Herring-class vessel, that can cause the primary manifold to shed its thermal lining." She traced the outer casing with her fingertips, moving with the assurance of someone reading a language in the metal itself. "Did you service the coil in the last year?" "The last 3 years," Mace said. She looked at him with an expression that was not quite judgment, and not quite pity, and lived somewhere between them that he didn't have a word for. "The insulation compound used in Herring-class secondary coils degrades under repeated thermal cycling," she said. "After approximately 18 months, the compound begins to crystallize at the contact points. It still functions, but the efficiency drops and the vibration signature changes. A Herring-class engine under load should have a fundamental frequency of 52 Hz. This one is running at 54.7. He stared at her. He had been listening to his engine for 4 years and had learned to interpret its sounds the way you learn to interpret a language you're not entirely fluent in. You get the gist. You miss the nuance. You hope the nuance isn't the part that matters. How do you know what a Herring-class should sound like?" "I know what most things should sound like," she said. "I listened to a great deal while I was wearing the collar. You hear things differently when you cannot respond to them." She lowered her hand. "I would like to look at the coil properly. Do you have secondary insulation compound?" He did not. He had almost none of the things she was going to want. He was beginning to understand. His ship was a 40-year-old hauler that he maintained the way most people maintained old things, attending to what broke loudly and ignoring what only complained quietly. And she was someone who heard the quiet things. "I can get what we need from the station supply bay," he said. "Make me a list." She made him a list. It took about 4 minutes and covered 1.5 screens on the portable unit he handed her, organized by priority with notes on acceptable substitutes, where the exact material was likely unavailable at a small station supply depot. He read through it on his way to the supply bay and had the peculiar sensation of looking at his own ship from the outside for the first time, seeing it as she saw it. A functional machine that was quietly asking for attention in a dozen places he'd never thought to look. He came back with 2 supply bags and found her in the cargo bay with the atmospheric sensor fully disassembled on the equipment rack. Each component laid out in an order that made no visual sense to him, but which he suspected corresponded to some internal logic entirely her own. "The grounding fault is in the secondary relay," she said without looking up. "Someone replaced the original relay with a non-standard component, probably 3 years ago. The replacement has a slightly different resistance profile. Over time, it created a signal drift that the sensor's calibration algorithm couldn't compensate for. 3 years ago, I had a port mechanic do an electrical checkover," Mace said. "He said everything was fine." "He used the wrong part and either didn't notice or didn't care," she said. She picked up one of the components and held it up to the bay's overhead light, turning it slightly. The drift would have been invisible for the first year. By the second year, the sensor was reading 12% high on particulate count. By now, it is reading approximately 30% high, which means every time you get a clean reading, you are getting it from a sensor that is catastrophically out of calibration. He paused. "I've been flying with a broken atmospheric sensor for 3 years. "You have been flying with an atmospheric sensor that was reporting false positives," she said. "If the actual particulate count had ever risen to a dangerous level, the sensor would still have registered it, just at a different threshold. That is a distinction without a lot of comfort." "No," she agreed, "it is not." She set the component down. "The relay needs to be replaced. Do you have a Series 7 junction relay in the supply bags?" He checked. He had a Series 7. When they got back to the cargo bay, she said, "I would like to fix the sensor and the recycler in the forward corridor. And your main thruster coupling is misaligned. I could hear it when we came up the ramp." "You can hear a misaligned thrust coupling. Orions are sensitive to vibration frequencies," she said. "It is a function of our inner ear structure. The coupling is 0.3 degrees off true. It costs you approximately 6% fuel efficiency per jump." He thought about his fuel budget. 6% was not nothing. 6% over the course of a year on a Herring-class cargo runner doing 2 or 3 jumps a month was the difference between a fuel surplus and a fuel deficit, and he had been operating at a fuel deficit for the better part of 18 months. "Okay," he said. "Also," she said, "the collar control key you are carrying is in your left front pocket and you have touched it twice since we left the auction ring. You do not need to keep checking whether it is there. I know it is there. I am not going to run." He felt his face warm. "I wasn't." "You were," she said, not unkindly. "It is a reasonable thing to do, but you do not need to." He took the key out of his pocket and set it on the equipment rack and left it there. He meant it as a gesture, but the moment he did it, it felt more like a statement. "Here is the thing that gives me control over you, and here is where I am putting it, and you can see it whenever you want, and I am walking away from it now." She watched him do it. Something in her expression changed in a way he couldn't entirely read, not relief, not the thing you'd expect. Something more like the registration of a fact, the way you look when something you suspected turns out to be true. She picked up a driver from the tool kit and went to look at the atmospheric sensor, and Mace went to find the fasteners he'd been missing for 3 months, and the marginal gain sat in Bay 14 of Scrapyard Station Verev, and breathed its recycled air, while the two of them worked in a companionable silence that surprised him with its quality. Not the silence of strangers being careful around each other, but the silence of people who have each found something to do and are doing it. And somewhere in the walls, the misaligned thruster coupling continued its quiet conversation with the hull, waiting for someone to correct it. He tried to remove the collar on the second day. He'd spent the previous evening doing research, which on the marginal gain meant sitting in the cockpit with a cup of something warm and working through the ship's nav computer's database for anything related to Synapse Series 9 restraint collars, their bonding mechanisms, their removal sequences, and the likelihood that an unlicensed freight pilot with a limited toolkit could successfully unbond one without killing the person wearing it. The results were not encouraging. The Synapse 9 bonded through a series of microfilament contacts embedded directly into the cervical nerve cluster. The collar itself was structural as much as electronic. The filaments were load-bearing, carrying a signal that regulated a small but non-trivial portion of the wearer's autonomic nervous system. Removing it incorrectly would cause the filaments to retract instantly, which the database described, with clinical understatement, as non-survivable neural trauma. The correct removal required the full key sequence, not the secondary control key Vosk had given him, but the primary sequence that had originally bonded the collar, which was stored in Vosk's control unit and which Mace did not have. He told her all of this in the morning, sitting across the galley table from her with the database entry between them on a portable screen, because he felt she had the right to see the exact size of the problem she was in. She read through it carefully. When she finished, she looked up at him. "Vosk will not give you the primary sequence," she said. "No. He would need a reason. Or we'd need to take it," Mace said, and then was quiet, because he was a freight pilot who delivered cargo and tried not to get shot at, and what he just said implied a fairly significant departure from that professional identity. Steve looked at him steadily. "You would do that?" "I'd rather not," he said honestly. "I'm hoping there's another option, but I'm not going to pretend it's off the table." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Orion neurology is not the same as humanoid standard. The filaments will have adapted to my nerve cluster rather than simply interfacing with it. A blanket neural disruption signal, the kind used on non-Orion species, might cause the filaments to retract partially rather than fully. Enough to break the autonomic regulation connection without fully retracting." He looked at her. "That sounds painful." "Yes." "Has anyone tried it?" "Not on an Orion. There are accounts of partial removal attempts on other species that suggest it is." She paused, and he got the sense she was editing something more direct into something more diplomatic, possible to survive. "I'm not trying something that has a significant chance of killing you," he said. "The collar has a significant chance of killing me," she said, evenly. "Every time Vosk's people used the compliance signal, it caused microhemorrhages in my cervical tissue. Over time, the damage is cumulative. I have, by my own estimate, perhaps 2 years before the collar's interference with my autonomic function becomes irreversible." He stared at her. 2 years. Perhaps less. He sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling, which had a stress crack in it he'd been meaning to seal for about 8 months. He was very aware in that moment of the sheer number of things he had been meaning to get to. "Okay," he said, "then we go get the sequence from Vosk." He didn't break into Vosk's office. He went in through the front door, which was easier and only slightly more dangerous. Vosk had an office on the station's administrative level, a pressurized room full of records consoles, and the particular smell of a Cathari male who had been doing well in a business that smelled bad. He looked up when Mace came in and registered the kind of mild surprise you show when a former customer appears, and you're calculating what they might want to complain about. "The Orion woman," Vosk said. "Problem with the merchandise." "I need the primary bonding sequence for her collar," Mace said. "I want to remove it." Vosk smiled. It was the same smile from the auction ring, patient and confident. "The sequence is proprietary. It's also non-transferable under Cathari acquisition law. Once a collar is sold, the bonding sequence stays with the licensed dealer. It's a safety provision. A safety provision, Mace repeated. For the acid. He thought about Steve in the galley this morning, eating the grain mix he'd put together from his food stores with the careful, deliberate manner of someone who had gotten used to eating whatever was provided and not commenting on it. He thought about the collar pulsing red at her throat. He thought about microhemorrhages. About 2 years, maybe less. How much, he said. It's not a question of price, Vosk said. Everything is a question of price, Mace said. What's yours? Vosk studied him for a moment with the look of a man deciding how much contempt he can display and still make a sale. The sequence is tied to a unit that also controls 7 other active collars currently bonded to other assets in my inventory. Transferring it to you would give you access to all of them. That is a significant liability. Then transfer just the Orion sequence. That's not how the unit is configured. Mace was quiet for a moment. He'd expected this. He'd prepared for this, or at least prepared for the fact that it would be this kind of conversation. The kind where the other person is not actually arguing, but simply describing the shape of your confinement. He'd had this conversation with customs inspectors and port authority officials and fuel depot managers, and every variation of mid-level official who had ever decided that the rules were load-bearing, because they personally held the load. He'd spent the previous night reading those rules, all of them. The Interstellar Commerce Accords were not short documents, and they were not written to be read by people without legal training, but they were written. And Mace had been reading dense technical documentation since he was 16 years old and learning to maintain a Heron-class engine from a manual that assumed the reader had 2 engineering degrees. The Accords were a different language than engine manuals, but the underlying logic was the same. Somewhere in the dense text, someone had made a rule that was supposed to prevent something, and if you found the right rule, you could make it do its original job. He had found 3. Sections 41, 43, and Appendix 12 of the Biological Asset Management Provisions, none of which Vosk had ever been asked to comply with by any party that actually knew they existed. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the secondary control key, the disk Vosk had given him at the transfer, and set it on Vosk's desk. "I'm giving this back," he said. Vosk looked at it. "Why?" "Because I don't want it," Mace said. "And because I'm going to be honest with you about something. I've spent the last 12 hours researching Synapse 9 collar compliance regulations under Interstellar Commerce Accords, sections 41 through 47, which cover biological asset management in unaffiliated space. It turns out that the Accords require licensed dealers to maintain records of collar-induced physiological adverse effects and provide those records to any holding party upon request. I'm requesting them." Vosk's smile didn't change, but something behind his eyes shifted. "That provision applies to certified biological asset brokers. It applies to any licensed dealer within Accord signatory space," Mace said. "Verev Station renewed its Accord signatory status 11 months ago. I checked. Also, microhemorrhaging in cervical nerve tissue caused by compliance signal activation is specifically listed in Accord Appendix 12 as a reportable adverse effect requiring immediate documentation and cessation of signal use." He paused. "I don't think you've been documenting it." The office was quiet. The records consoles hummed. Somewhere outside, a cargo lifter made a sound like a mechanical animal being sick. "You came in here to extort me," Vosk said. "I came in here to buy a removal sequence," Mace said. "How we get there is up to you." Vosk looked at him for a long time. Mace held the look and did not fidget and did not touch his pockets and thought about a stress crack in his ceiling and a misaligned thruster coupling and 6% fuel efficiency per jump, and waited. Vosk opened his records console. The sequence was a 40-character alphanumeric string, and Mace photographed it with his comm unit and confirmed the image was readable before he stood up from the chair across Vosk's desk. "If I ever see you in my auction ring again," Vosk said, "the processing fees will be considerably higher." "Fair," Mace said. He picked up the secondary control key from the desk and dropped it in his jacket pocket. "I'll take this back too, in case there are regulations about proper disposal." She was in the engine room when he got back. He'd been gone 4 hours. In those 4 hours she had apparently disassembled the main thruster coupling, corrected the alignment by 0.3 degrees, reassembled it, and moved on to something in the power distribution grid that he had not previously identified as a problem, but which she was now explaining involved a resonance loop that under specific jump conditions could cause a cascade draw from the main battery. "That sounds bad," he said. "It is survivable," she said, "but it would be unpleasant." She looked up from the distribution panel at whatever expression he was wearing. "Did you get it?" He showed her his comm unit with the sequence on it. She went very still. Not the stillness from the cage, this was a different kind, the kind that comes before something rather than as a substitute for it. Her hands, which had been steady on the distribution panel, did not move for a moment. "You got it," she said. "I got it," he said. "Do you want to try tonight or?" "Tonight," she said, "yes." The removal took 3 hours and was, as she had predicted, painful. Mace had done his research. He'd sourced a neural interface stabilizer from the station's medical supply bay, a piece of equipment normally used for surgical guidance in low-resource environments, and rigged it to deliver the disruption signal she described. He'd read everything he could find about Orion neurology, which was not much, because there was not much written about the Orions by anyone who had thought of them as subjects worth writing about rather than inventory. He had her sit in the cockpit chair, which was the most comfortable seat on the ship, and he stood behind her with the stabilizer and the sequence on his comm unit, and she put her hands flat on her knees and breathed. "Tell me if I need to stop," he said. "You will not need to stop," she said. "Tell me anyway." A pause. "All right." He entered the first segment of the sequence into the stabilizer and watched the collar's indicator light shift from red to amber, which the manual said meant the primary bond was in standby. He entered the second segment. The light pulsed twice. He entered the third and felt the stabilizer's housing warm in his hand as it drew power for the disruption signal. He said, "On 3. She said nothing. She had her eyes fixed on a point through the cockpit viewport, the station's outer hull visible through the bay doors, gray and pitted and unremarkable, with the focused stillness of someone who has decided to meet a thing directly rather than flinch from it. He had a sudden strong sense of all the other things she'd met directly with that same stillness. Compliance signals, Vosk's holding pen, 3 years of people deciding what she was worth. She had been doing the armor thing for so long that the armor had become load-bearing. He was about to ask her to set it down, at least for a few minutes, and he understood that for her that was possibly the harder thing. "I've got you," he said. He wasn't sure exactly what he meant by it. He meant it anyway. She was quiet for a moment. Something in her shoulders, some particular tension he hadn't consciously registered as a permanent feature of her posture, let go by a fraction. He counted, he triggered the signal. She made a sound that he did not want to think about later but would anyway, the involuntary kind, short and sharp, the kind of sound that comes when you have committed to not making any sound and your body overrules you. Her hands on her knees went white at the knuckles. He kept the signal steady at the duration she had specified, 7 seconds, no more, no less, and counted them with a precision he had never applied to counting before, because the precision was the only thing he could give her right now that was worth anything. The collar's light went dark. It took him another 40 minutes to work the physical housing off. The filaments had retracted, but the outer collar itself had locked on retraction and had to be eased free contact by contact, which required patience and small tools and her directing him quietly when he was close to a nerve. When it finally came away, He had to set it down on the console because his hands were shaking. She sat with her hands in her lap, and her head tilted slightly forward and breathed. The skin of her neck where the collar had been was marked with the impression of it, a band of slightly darker blue-gray, the microhemorrhage sites visible as a ring of small shadows at the nerve cluster points. It looked like a map of what had been done to her. After a while she reached up and touched the bare skin of her throat with 2 fingers. She did it the same way she'd touched the atmospheric sensor, careful, precise, assessing. He thought about what it felt like to touch the place where something had been. "How does it feel?" he said. "Strange," she said. "Everything feels very loud." A pause. "That is normal, I think. The collar suppressed several autonomic sensory pathways. They are returning." He got up from where he'd been crouching behind the seat and went to the galley and came back with 2 cups of something warm and set one on the console arm next to her. She looked at it. "Grain tea," he said. "It's what I have. My mother used to make it." He sat down in the co-pilot's chair. She was a cargo pilot too. This ship was hers before it was mine. She thought naming it the Marginal Gain would be funny. Like the margin of profit was just barely enough to keep going, but it was always exactly enough. Steve picked up the cup. She held it in both hands and looked at the steam. "My people named everything," she said. "Ships, tools, the particular quality of light at the end of a day's work. We thought names were a kind of attention, a way of saying, 'I see you, I know what you are.'" She was quiet for a moment. "There are 11 Orions left. I am one of them. The others are scattered. I don't know where." She paused. "The collar's owner before Vosk used me to find 2 of them. I did not tell him. The signal he used when I would not comply." She stopped. "You don't have to." "I want to say it," she said. "The signal caused enough pain that most people comply with what they're told. I did not tell him where the others were. He escalated the signal. I still did not tell him." She looked at the cup in her hands. "He sold me to Vosk because I was not useful enough. Vosk thought a more controlled environment would break that. It did not." Mace looked at her for a long moment. He thought about the Dranian in the front row. He thought about what the Dranian would have used the collar's compliance function for, and decided he was glad he didn't know the specifics. "I'm not going to use it," he said. "The collar," he hesitated. "I'm going to put it out the airlock." She looked up from the cup. Those silver-green eyes in the cockpit's half-dark, and the bare ring at her throat, and the quality of the silence when someone hears something they have been waiting a long time to hear. "All right," she said. He picked up the collar from the console. He walked to the airlock. He put it in the inner chamber, sealed the inner door, opened the outer, and listened to the brief sound of atmosphere displacing into vacuum. He came back to the cockpit and sat down. "What happens now?" she said. "I have a cargo run to Heron's Point," he said. 12-day transit. After that I was going to try to find a nav array because mine is currently a hand-drawn star chart and prayers, but—" He paused. "If you wanted to come along, I think you probably know more about how this ship works than I do at this point, and the co-pilot's seat is empty, and I can pay you in route percentage once we're clear of the debt load." She looked at the co-pilot's seat. She looked at the cockpit viewport where Verev Station's bay doors were showing the dark beyond them. "I know 12 of the 11 standard jump routes through the Cathari Reach," she said, "and 4 that are not in your nav database. 4 new routes would be worth considerably more than route percentage," he said. "Yes," she said. She set the cup down on the console arm and turned in the cockpit chair to face the viewport properly, the stance of someone settling in for a long journey. "I also know what is wrong with your port attitude thruster. You are rotating 0.7 degrees off true on lateral burns. It has been making your landings slightly harder than they need to be." "I thought that was normal." "Nothing about a difficult landing is normal," she said. "Everything that is hard can be made easier. It is only a matter of knowing what to look for." He looked at her, the bare line at her throat, the hands that had been steady on the distribution panel, the tilt of her head that was its own kind of precision, and thought about margins. The margin of profit that was always exactly enough. The margin of distance between what a thing costs and what it's worth. "Thank you," he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "You said you bought me so the other man couldn't have me. That is true, but it is not complete." "No. People do not spend past their budget for reasons," she said. "Not reasons they can explain in the moment, but reasons nonetheless." She looked at him with those pale, running light eyes, and something in her expression was the same directness he'd seen in the cage and hadn't been able to name then. He could name it now. It was the look of someone who has decided to trust a thing and is letting you know that they know exactly what they are doing. "I saw you before the bidding started," she said. "You were looking at the nav array display in the adjacent bay. That is what you came here to buy. I knew you could not afford both." "You knew that?" "I calculated it," she said. "From your ship registration markings on the bay, marginal gain, Cathari registry, 40 years old Heron class. I looked up the route license fees and the standard debt load for a vessel of that age and type, and I knew approximately what you could carry." A pause. "I also knew the man in the front row and what he does with what he buys. I have met 3 Dranian collectors in my life, and I knew what his ledger meant." Mace was very still. "Are you saying you were hoping I'd outbid him?" "I am saying," she said carefully, "that when you raised your hand the first time I thought this one. I do not know why. I could not have told you in that moment." She looked back out the viewport. "I have had occasion to observe a great many people across the last 3 years. Most of them look at a cage and see what's inside it. You looked at it and saw the inside." He didn't have anything to say to that. He wasn't sure there was anything to say that wouldn't make the moment smaller. "I'm going to file the departure request," he said. "I will check the pre-flight systems," she said. She reached for the co-pilot's console with the familiar confidence of someone who knows exactly where every control is, which she shouldn't have known because she'd only been on the ship for 30 hours. And Mace watched her hands move across the panel and thought she must have memorized it while she was supposed to be sleeping. She probably had. On the 3rd night aboard the Marginal Gain, Mace woke up at what his ship's clock called 200 and found her in the cockpit. She was in the co-pilot's chair with the nav console lit, but she wasn't navigating. She had the ship's communication relay open and was listening, not to any active transmission, but to the static between frequencies, the background noise of space that most people filtered out without thinking about it. Her eyes were open and her hands were in her lap, and she was completely still in a way that had shifted, in the past 2 days, from its original armor quality to something else. Something like rest. He almost went back to the cabin. Instead, he got 2 cups of grain tea and sat down in the pilot's seat. She didn't look up, but she wasn't startled either. "The relay on this frequency range carries ghost signals from decommissioned Orion communication buoys," she said. "My people placed them throughout the reach as navigational markers. The buoys were destroyed when our stations were taken, but some of the relay echoes persist in the background radiation." She paused. "It is not much, but it is the closest thing to hearing my people's voices that I have." He held his cup and listened. He couldn't hear anything in the static that sounded like voices or signals, but she could, apparently, and so he sat quietly and let her listen. After a while she said, "When I was a child, my father would walk the perimeter of our station every morning at dawn. It was a habit from before I was born. He said the station needed someone to pay attention to it, not to fix anything, just to look. To notice whether the pressure seals sounded different, whether the light quality in the habitat dome had shifted, whether the water recyclers were cycling at the right interval." She was quiet for a moment. "I used to think it was superstition. As if the station could feel whether someone was paying attention to it. But now I think he was right. Things that are attended to last longer. They know someone cares whether they keep working." "Is that why you fix things?" Mace said. She considered this. "I fix things because they can be made better," she said, but I noticed them because of my father. A pause. He died when the Cathari consolidation forces came to our station. He was in the outer ring doing his morning walk. The first strike took the outer ring. She said it flatly, with the flatness of someone who has said a true thing so many times that it has worn smooth. My mother evacuated with 6 others. I was already off station on a maintenance contract. When I came back, the station was a field of debris, and Cathari consolidation ships were cataloging the salvage. Her hands tightened slightly in her lap. They cataloged me. The grain tea had gone from hot to warm. The static on the relay played its empty song of ghost signals and background radiation. "I'm sorry," Mace said, and meant it in the plain and useless way you mean it when the words are too small for the thing they're describing. "You did not do it," she said. "A great many people who could have stopped it did not do it. You are not one of them." He thought about the auction ring again. He thought about raising his hand for the first time, at 1,000, and the feeling of doing something without a plan. "The 11 who are left," he said. "Do you know anything about them, beyond the coordinates?" She was quiet for a long moment. "3 I know personally. 2 are engineers like me. One was a cartographer. She mapped the inner reach for 30 years. The coordinates I have suggest she may be on a station in the Naren cluster, which is not a place a cartographer would choose to go voluntarily." She paused. "The others I know only by reputation or by the records I accessed while I was in Vosk's inventory. He had files on Orions. He had been building a collection." She said the word with a particular precise distaste. "He had files on 7 of us. That is how I know some of them are still alive." "We'll go to all 7, Mace said. He hadn't planned to say that. But he said it with the same quality of not planning that had put his hand up in the auction ring. The thing that happened when his brain finished a calculation slightly ahead of his mouth, and both of them just went with it. She looked at him. "That would take a significant amount of time." "I have a significant amount of ship," he said. "And according to you, 4 routes through the reach that no one else knows. That's not nothing." She looked at him with the silver-green eyes and the bare line at her throat, and he understood in the silence after that she was trying to find the angle of what he was doing. The trade, the benefit, the mechanism by which being helpful to her served his interests, because that was the grammar she'd been living in, the language in which every kindness had a price buried in its conjugation. "There is no catch," he said. "I'm not doing math on this one." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she looked back at the relay and its ghost signals. "My father would have liked you," she said. "He believed in attending to things." "So do you," Mace said. "Yes," she said. "I suppose I do." They sat in the cockpit in the blue-gray dark of jump transit and drank grain tea that had gone lukewarm, and the marginal gain moved through the compressed starfield toward Heron's Point. And somewhere in the walls, the thruster coupling that she had corrected turned true and silent and perfect. The jump to Heron's Point took 11 days by the route she knew. It should have taken 14 by any route in Mace's nav database, a difference that would have annoyed him deeply if he'd had more energy left for annoyance after the first 3 days, during which she disassembled and reassembled 5 separate ship systems, correctly diagnosed a resonance oscillation in the jump drive that his ship's own diagnostic had not flagged in 2 years, and ate approximately everything in his food stores that contained protein. "Orion metabolism," she said, the second time she apologized for finishing the reserves. "It's fine," he said. "I'll resupply at Heron's. I could calculate a more efficient resupply schedule if you give me your route projections for the next quarter," she said. He gave her his route projections for the next quarter. She gave him back a resupply schedule, a maintenance calendar, 2 fuel depot alternatives that would cut his overhead by 11%, and a list of 6 cargo contracts currently listed on the Heron's Point exchange that could be combined into a circuit route significantly more efficient than his current one. "How did you find these?" he said. "I have been monitoring the exchange through your nav computer's communication relay," she said. "I hope that is acceptable." It's very acceptable, he said. She looked at him with the not-quite smile he was learning to read. You are easy to help, she said. Many people are not. They want assistance, but they do not want to be assisted. They want information, but they do not want to be told things. You simply ask what you need and let me answer. Is that unusual? In my experience, she said, it is the rarest thing there is. He thought about that. He thought about Vosk and the Dranian and the long list of people she'd passed through before the auction ring, and the compliance signal, and the 2 years she'd given herself on the collar's damaged timeline. He thought about how she'd sat in the cage, as if the space was hers, not because she believed it was, but because she decided, a long time ago, that the alternative was giving them something real. What do you want to do, he said, after Harren's, if you could go anywhere? She was quiet for a long moment, looking out the viewport at the compressed starfield of jump transit. I want to find the others, she said. The 11. I know where 2 of them might be. I have coordinates, places they were last reported through channels that collar traders don't monitor. A pause. I could not go myself. I was constrained, but now. Then that's what we do, he said. She looked at him. That is a considerable change to your route schedule. The schedule was already wrong, he said. You said so yourself. I said it could be made more efficient. Same thing, he said. She looked at him for a moment more with those silver-green eyes, and then she looked back at the viewport and said, very quietly, Sieve means the last light before a storm. My parents gave me that name because I was born in a storm's last hour, when the light comes back through the clouds and everything is very clear. He waited. I do not want to be the last of anything, she said. I want to be the beginning. He thought about the marginal gain, his mother's ship, its funny name, the margin that was always exactly enough. He thought about the way she'd told him about the thruster alignment and the atmospheric sensor and the resonance in the jump drive, the way she pointed at what was broken and said, this can be made better. Everything that is hard can be made easier. Then that's what you are, he said. She didn't say anything, but she put one hand flat on the co-pilot's console, the same gesture she'd used in the engine room when she first touched the distribution panel, assessing, precise, certain. She was telling the ship she was here. Harren's Point was a mid-sized trading hub with a population of approximately 40,000 and a port authority that charged twice what the service was worth and didn't apologize for it. Mace landed the marginal gain in Bay 6, which cost more than Bay 14 on Verev, but had atmospheric recyclers that worked properly, which Sieve approved of. She stood in the cargo bay while he filed the landing forms and watched the port through the open bay door with an expression he recognized as the same one she'd had on the day they left Verev, looking at the sky as if she was orienting herself by it, the way a navigator uses a star. He came back from the port console and stood next to her. The light on Harren's was warm and orange-tinted, filtered through the habitat's environmental shield, the particular quality of late-day light that comes when everything is clear after a storm. The first coordinates are 6 days from here, she said, by a route that is not on your charts. Show me, he said. She pulled up his nav console's interface on the comm unit. She'd started using 3 days into the jump. She'd asked his permission first, with the same precise courtesy she brought to everything, and he'd said yes without thinking about it. And she drew a line through the reach that curved around the standard transit corridors and moved through a gap in the asteroid density that wasn't mapped because no one had bothered to map it. How do you know this route? He said. My people used it, she said. Before, she paused. We were not traders or fighters. We were engineers, builders. We made things work. When a ship needed to travel somewhere difficult, we found the way. He looked at the route, he looked at her. He thought about the collar and the auction and 1,350 credits he didn't have, and the nav array he never bought, and the way she'd looked at him across the room when the bidding started and he'd seen, without understanding why, that the thing in the cage was looking back. Marginal gain, he said. My mother said the name was funny, but she also said that every margin that's enough is really a starting point. You just have to know what you're starting. Steve was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I would like to name the ship. She has a name. A new name, an Orion name, to be spoken alongside the human one. She paused. We name things we see clearly, things we want to pay attention to. He thought about attention. He thought about the fact that she had found all of this ship's problems not because she was looking for problems, but because she looked at things the way her people looked at them, as if everything mattered enough to understand. What's the Orion name? He said. She said a word that his ear caught as a sound with texture in it, something between a vibration and a breath. She said, it means the thing that holds together. He stood next to her in the bay door with the orange light of Heron's Point coming in warm off the tarmac, and the ship's atmospheric recyclers cycling clean air for the first time in a long time, and the jump route to the first set of coordinates sitting on the nav unit between them. All right, he said, let's go hold something together. She turned her head to look at him, and the light caught the bare skin of her throat where the collar had been, the mark of it still there, not healed yet, the shadow of what had been done, and she was looking at him the way she'd looked at the ship's systems when she first touched them, seeing clearly, deciding what to do next. Yes, she said. Let's. The marginal gain sat on the tarmac at Heron's Point and breathed, and in Bay 6 the cargo doors stood open in the warm light, and inside it a man was plotting a route he didn't have charts for while a woman who was the last light before a storm showed him where to go. The thruster coupling was aligned to true, the atmospheric recyclers were calibrated, the resonance in the jump drive was gone. Everything that had been wrong was being made right, one precise and careful adjustment at a time. That was how it always started, not with the big moment, not with the rescue or the revelation or the grand declaration, but with someone who knew what was broken, someone who was willing to say so, and a ship that was exactly enough. The margin held. It always did.